Hello, welcome to CrossCurrents, produced by the City of Fort Collins in cooperation with the Larimer County League of Women Voters. I'm Barbara Rutstein, the moderator of today's program. The views expressed on this program are solely those of the participants and do not reflect the City of Fort Collins or the Larimer County League of Women Voters' views. Today we are meeting on Zoom because our usual in-person format in the City Council chambers is not available. We hope we can have a full discussion of the issue without having any technical difficulties. Our topic is Amendment B, should Gallagher be repealed? The Gallagher Amendment to the Colorado Constitution was passed in 1982 to protect homeowners to some degree from rising property tax assessments and to make sure that businesses paid their fair share of property tax. It also stipulates that residents will pay 45% of the statewide property tax and businesses will pay 55%. Because of the exponential growth in residential property and the increased value of residential property, the assessment rate has gone down from 21% of value in 1982 to 7.15% now. Over the same 38 years, the non-residential rate has stayed the same at 29%. The result is that businesses pay more than 4 times the residential property tax rate. The original intent of Gallagher was that the tax rate would go up or down to maintain the funding of local services. However, when the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, or TABOR, was passed in 1992, the tax rate could not go up without a vote of the people. Some communities have passed mill levy overrides for education and special districts, but many, especially in rural areas, have not seen the growth in residences and businesses that would increase their tax base. Thus, rural areas have not been able to pass mill levy increases to keep up with their need for various services. School, fire, and hospital districts have been severely impacted. Gallagher and TABOR together have created a fiscal knot in the state and local budgetary practices. Amendment B hopes to untangle one part of this knot. The question for voters is whether this is a good way to fix the problem. To discuss this issue, we have Bernie Boucher, chair of B for Colorado, and Clay Vigoda, campaign manager for Protect Our Colorado Homes. Joshua Fudge is budget director of Larimer County, and he will give us some local perspectives. Welcome to you and to our viewing audiences. First, what would you like to add to my description? What have I left out?
Barbara, if I can go first, and Clay, if you would prefer to go first, that's fine.
No, Bernie, I'm more than happy to go after either way.
Okay. Clay and I have worked together on other issues and known each other for a long time. First of all, thank you for the league, and thank you for the City of Fort Collins for putting this together. It's important that folks understand Gallagher and the implications of Gallagher. This is probably the most complex thing in our Constitution, with the possible exception of TABOR itself. The one thing I would add, Barbara, to your description is that repealing the Gallagher Amendment leaves in place the 7.15 assessment rate for residences, which means that you pay property taxes on 7.15% of the value of your property. And it will leave in place the 29% for all other categories. Colorado is blessed with the third lowest residential property tax burden in the country. And it will leave that very low rate in place, which can only be passed by a measure voted on by the entire state. So I think I'll stop there. The rest of your summary, I think, was very accurate, very well done, and I appreciate it.
Okay, Clay.
And I too want to thank the league and Larimer County for putting this together for us in City of Fort Collins. Bernie hit on the biggest point of contention between the proponents of this amendment and the opponents of this amendment. Bernie just talked about that this would keep the 7.15% rate in place. But what it doesn't tell you is that this amendment is not about assessment rates. This amendment is about dollars in your pocket and how many of those dollars you end up having to pay in taxes. And according to the tax administrator of the state of Colorado, in a briefing she gave the state legislature back in the early summer, if Amendment B passes, homeowners in this state will pay an additional $450,566,168 in the very first year. And in every year going forward, that amount will either stay at that $450+ million additional amount that homeowners would pay that they otherwise wouldn't if the Gallagher Amendment stayed in place, or it will increase. This amendment over time, and over time meaning in the next 5 or 6 years if it passes, will be the largest tax increase in the state's history. Because it keeps going forever.
Okay, we'll get into the details of that, I think, a little further.
And the only thing I want to add into that is when you gave your description, you talked about the fact that the rural areas of the state have been unable to pass mill levies to fund different districts. It's not they've been unable to do that. They have chosen not to do that.
Okay.
They don't have the tax base that the urban areas do, but it is a choice that you see. You know, Gallagher is unique to Colorado, but in 49 other states, this disparity between urban and rural is the exact same. Rural voters, by and large, don't look for the same level of services that urban voters do. And you see this backfilling in school districts and in different special districts in every single state. So this is not unique to Gallagher.
Okay.
Or Colorado.
You're getting ahead of us.
Sorry.
Okay.
My apologies.
Josh, would you like to add anything?
I don't have a whole lot to add. I think you all gave a really excellent overview of it. The one interesting thing about it, and maybe a lot of folks don't realize, is that it considers the split in values and property tax paid statewide. So it treats, if you live in the Front Range, or you live out in the plains in the east, or you live in a ski resort town, it has an impact on your community pretty much all the same. And so as far as the tax rate goes, and the impact on the finances of any local district, whether it's a county, school district, or whatever, can really depend on where in the state it is. And maybe I'm getting a little ahead. Larimer County has been okay, even as the residential assessment rate has ratcheted down over the years because of strong growth in population and growth in values. But there's other, as you all mentioned, there's parts of the state where that hasn't happened. So the Gallagher Amendment has had a more of an impact on them. Okay,
very good. Now, what was the amendment supposed to accomplish, and did it do that over 38 years? Why don't we go ahead, Clay?
I'll go first, and maybe Bernie, you and I just alternate back and forth on it. The amendment was intended to do exactly what it has done, which is that it's kept residential property rates from becoming the major property tax source in the state. It has saved homeowners in the state over $35 billion in the last 38 years. And one of the people involved, well, two of the people involved in the opponents on this are Dennis Gallagher and Ron Stewart, state senators who wrote the Gallagher Amendment. And when asked about this, they will tell you it is working exactly the way it's supposed to. that there are all sorts of other areas where big business corporations, oil and gas interests have the opportunity to do tax breaks and do tax breaks, 161 of them, I think, at the last count on this, that keep their taxes low. This is really one of the only tax breaks that homeowners have, and it's been institutionalized in the Colorado Constitution. And so it is working exactly the way it's supposed to.
Okay, Bernie?
Well, I would differ with that, and I've gone back and looked at some of the newspaper coverage from 1982 when this was proposed, and it was intended to keep a reasonable balance between the amount of taxes paid by residential properties and all other properties. And because the balance a couple of years before this was 45% by residences and 55% by everything else, it set up this really bizarre process of adjusting the assessment rates to maintain that level of tax generation. I don't think anyone expected that the result would be that commercial interests, your coffee shop, your hair salon, your child care center pays property taxes at 4 times what residences do. And the other thing that I think is really important to understand is because the way that this formula works, the rate of transfer of taxes to small businesses is accelerating. If the next round of cuts is allowed to go into place, small business will pay taxes at 5 times the rate that residences do. And the projection for 2 years after that could be 7 times. At a certain point, this has just become unfair. It's killing jobs. And the impact that nobody really anticipated is that when this ratchets down the amount of revenues produced for school districts, and 51% of local property taxes go to school districts, the state is required to backfill that. When Gallagher was passed, the state paid about 1/3 of the cost of education for K-12 in the state. That number is now about 70%. But the really urgent thing that everyone should keep in mind is the state's budget is in crisis.
Okay, we'll get to that too.
Okay.
Josh, did you want to add anything there? No. Okay, that's fine. Now, why did a bipartisan group put this on the ballot this year? And I want to emphasize that it is bipartisan, which in this day of age is pretty amazing. So does anybody have a good reason for that, or did it have to do with the current economic situation because of the pandemic?
Barbara, it actually started before that.
Okay.
The discussion about Gallagher has been going on for a good number of years. And 2 years ago, the General Assembly created an interim study group of legislators and others to consider what could be done about Gallagher. At the same time, a nonpartisan group called Building a Better Colorado did focus groups all across the state. Over 10,000 members of Colorado citizenry participated in those. They were a group that very much reflected the state, urban and rural, Democrat, Republican, unaffiliated, and their strong recommendation, over 80%, was the best solution is repeal Gallagher. That's the message that got to the legislature, and over 3/4 of all of the legislators agreed that that's the best fix and referred this to the ballot for consideration by the voters next month.
Okay, Clay?
And I guess I'd have to note that the putting of, if the issue in our taxes is not about Gallagher, it's about the Tabor Amendment and the Gallagher Amendment and Amendment 23, which is done, talks about funding of schools. And it's how all 3 of those work together. And we're not going to sit here and say that there isn't a serious issue with the tax structure in the state of Colorado. That's been talked about since Bernie was in the legislature. There, for the last 20 plus years since Tabor, for almost 30 years since Tabor passed, the way those three pieces work together has created a huge issue. But going after one, rather than doing full tax code restructuring, they've gone after only the Gallagher Amendment. In the midst of a pandemic, when 500,000 Coloradans are either unemployed or underemployed, with the economic turmoil that's going on, to do what effectively amounts to a tax increase on homeowners, when Colorado, Bernie talks about that Gallagher is a job killer and creates issues for our business community. In December of 2019, U.S. News and World Report said Colorado had the fourth best economy for businesses and the number one performing economy in the entire country. So the idea that Gallagher or anything else is killing business here is a fallacy. The fact is that nationally, we're one of the best economic places to do business in this country. And in the midst of a pandemic, it's I hate to use the term, but it's virtually immoral to be doing this on the backs of homeowners.
Okay, well, let's talk about how the repeal would definitely affect property taxes. Would they go up or down or stay the same? You're saying the 4.15 would be the same, and you're saying that they would go up a lot. How do we do that? Or Josh, do you know what effect it would have?
Well, as I understand it, if the referendum passes and Gallagher is repealed, that would enable the residential assessment rate to stay at 7.15% until the legislature acted to change it. What that would likely result in, at least here in Larimer County, is, as we all know, the values of our homes have gone up quite a bit over the last 5 years. That's slowed down a little bit here in the past year or so. And so theoretically, your taxes would likely go up in the 2022, when you pay taxes in 2022, by whatever the value of your home increases, because the residential assessment rate has stayed the same, and so the value, would push that up. There's a little bit of variance in tax rates. Counties and school districts and everybody else can change their mill levy for a couple of little things, but in general, your taxes would go up if the value of your home goes up. As a result of the economic situation in COVID, combined with what was already a slowing down of a housing market, they could go down if the assessed value of your home dropped as well, because again, that rate stays the same. If the amendment or if the referendum does not pass, then what would happen is that when the assessors value your homes in next year for the 2022 budget, so they'll go out in 21, assess the value of homes, the state has projected that the residential assessment rate would drop under 6%, so from 7.15 down to about 5.88. And so just think if the value of your home, if you could sell it for $100,000, currently it would be taxed on $7,150. Instead, after that, if it stayed flat, you would be taxed on $5,880. And so certainly your taxes would drop for the drop in the assessed or taxable value of your home.
And it's highly unlikely that a home would lose value. It might stay the same, but it's not likely that it would lose value in Colorado. That seems to be the case.
There can be some variance, but yeah, in general, you can plan on it rising. Probably not as fast as it's risen over the past 5 or 6 years, but theoretically, it should rise a little bit.
Clay?
And the tax administrator of the state of Colorado, in that same report that estimated that the assessment rate dropping down to the 5.88, has estimated that the assessed values, what the actual values of houses could raise in the 10% range. In some places, Denver, some of the places along the Front Range, that number could be approaching 20%. And so you could see a situation where even as the assessed value or the actual value of your house goes up and the assessed value rate goes down, you could see yourself paying the same amount of taxes or even more if the actual value of your house has gone up. The one thing that I think is very clear on this is that in the next few years, the amount of taxes that the state is going to be able to collect is going to go down significantly. We are in the midst of one of the biggest economic downturns in this country's history. And so there is no question that that is going to affect, and I think that, Josh, you have a graph that you'll be putting up. You'll see the amount of revenues going in. I think the governments need to look at what we all have to do when we have an economic downturn. We have to budget our money better. We have to be smarter about how we do things. And I'm sort of not very sympathetic to the state's plight when between 2009 and 2019, the amount of actual dollars that were raised by the state through residential property rates increased almost 62%, 61.5% in that 10-year period of time. And we had more people move into the state, but those increased residential rates have been a huge boom to the state in its ability to do stuff. And in good times, that it's one of the problems we have with Tabor. And Bertie can speak to this. In good times, we don't necessarily get to reap all of that, but we do on the property tax. And we have, over the last 10 years, gone, from 3.1 to 5, I think it was $5.7 billion raised in residential property taxes. And so if we find ourselves in a short-term place where we have to budget tighter, that's what we all have to do. And I think going with Amendment B right now is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There were other things the legislature could have done, like hold the renewed assessment and moved it from 2021 further out. And I've been told two things: either that would take a vote of the people, or that could be done legislatively because it's not in the Constitution. But in either case, we could have asked the voters for a temporary hiatus until we all get back on our feet again. That's not what this does. This is a tax hit to homeowners forever.
Okay, Bernie.
Clay, you say that this affects the state's revenues. It doesn't. I mean, the state does not get property taxes. And I think it's disingenuous to mix those two. This is a local issue. And there is an impact on the state budget when it is required to backfill the loss of education revenues. But the state's budget is not the recipient of any property tax revenues.
But it was the counties that took advantage of that 61% increase.
The other thing that I think needs to be pointed out is Joanne Groff has walked back those numbers that she gave us because of a very important factor. Many districts have de-Gallagherized, and most of our mill levy bond overrides have a factor in them that says if the residential assessment rate goes down, the mill levies automatically go up. Our numbers suggest that that's about $300 million of automatic adjustments to increase revenues and maintain the money necessary for bond issues. So that has become pretty standard across the state, but it doesn't deal with those districts that are not using bond issues, like your fire district, like your ambulance district, like your library district.
Explain that again to me, or let me repeat it to you so I understand it. You're saying that if Pooter R1 floated a bond for building schools, there can be a provision in that that would what, exempt it from Gallagher or allow the mill levy to go up?
It's a workaround, and it solves one problem, but it creates another. When the residential assessment rate drops, the mill levy automatically increases to keep that stream of revenue neutral.
Ah, okay. Josh, has the county been involved in that? We've had a few bond issues.
So the county did look at the idea of floating its mill levy. Our commissioners had a couple of work sessions on that idea. What it would do for the county is similar to how Bernie described it. Ask the voters, in the event that the residential assessment rate causes a reduction in revenues, may the county float its mill levy or basically increase it to generate the same amount of revenue that it would have had the residential assessment rate not dropped. They ultimately decided not to put that question on the ballot in November. The reason being it's a complicated issue, as we're learning tonight. And so there wasn't a whole lot of time to educate the voters on the impacts of that. It's also, it can be difficult, they said, to try to educate folks on what may happen. The county could lose a lot of revenue if the state referendum doesn't pass and you don't vote for this. And that's a really hard argument in case to make, they felt. So they ultimately decided not to put that question on the ballot in November. There are a few counties across the state, I believe, that are doing it. I think they would be the first to ask that question. I don't believe any counties have done it yet. Fire districts have. There's a few here in Larimer County that have done it. I believe Boulder is one of them. I think City and County of Broomfield is one, and then some smaller ones as well. And so what they ultimately decided is, there will be two new county commissioners next year. And so should the residential assessment rate end up dropping, then they could, if that new board of county commissioners decided, they could go to the voters in November of 21 to ask that question. And
Barbara, if I could add on to that, Josh, you described it exactly correctly. I don't think at this point any counties have de-Gallagherized, but a number of fire districts have. And it has become relatively standard when school districts do bond issues that this is included. Our numbers show that the amount of increases that will automatically happen if B doesn't pass is in the neighborhood of about $300 million a year, eating up a good portion of the $500 million that Clay just described.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that both Josh and Bernie have hit on what I believe is the best kind of politics, local politics. People deciding for themselves if they want to fund something. And the de-Gallagherizing or the increasing of a mill levy on your special districts, on your fire districts, your library districts, your school districts. These are all things that people can and should have the opportunity to do and make the decision for themselves. Now, that hasn't worked well in some of the areas of the state. But by and large, especially in the urban areas, you have seen that those kinds of special district elections have a good percentage of passing because people get to decide for themselves what is important. Getting rid of problems statewide, and go ahead, Bernie.
Well, there's a number of issues there. First, we've got over 3,200 special districts in Colorado.
We do.
And that's one of the offshoots of Tabor. Good or bad, it is what it is. So what you're really talking about is over 3,000 elections to try to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish in one election for the entire state. The Special Districts Association has strongly endorsed the repeal because they see the impact to all of their members of these steadily decreasing residential assessment rates.
But Bernie, part of the reason they endorse this is that if the assessment rate stays at 7.15 instead of 5.88, that's more money for their districts on an ongoing basis. And understand,
it's not more money. It's not less.
The less that we're seeing is a momentary drop in time. It is a pandemic drop in time. Special districts haven't been affected. School districts certainly have, and because of the state's inability to backfill. But the idea, that $450 million I talked about was only the county taxes and the school taxes, because that's all that Joanne Groff, the tax administrator, gave. The one thing they didn't talk about was the amount of money, which we've calculated as another $180 million on top of that go to those 3,200 special districts that you're talking about. And of course, they're going to vote to keep your taxes higher. That makes, the idea that they're endorsing.
But Clay, they're not voting to keep their taxes higher. They're voting to keep from having to make cuts of 18%. That means that an ambulance district has to decide, are we going to lay off people or are we going to sell an ambulance? Those are real discussions. I've had those discussions with special districts, and they're being forced to make decisions that they don't want to make.
Well, let me tell you a discussion I had last week, Bernie, talking with an elderly couple who lived in Denver, who, if with the assessed values going up on their houses, are just barely staying in the house they've been in for over 40 years. And if this passes and they don't see that decrease in their assessment rate and their assessed value keeps going out, they're going to be priced straight out of their homes. And in that situation, where does an elderly couple in Denver, Colorado go to when they can't afford their house anymore? This affects Amendment B and the keeping the assessment rate high also affects the cost of renters. That's why the Apartment Association of the state is strongly opposed to Amendment B, because this is going to make rents keep going up. This affects our ability to provide affordable housing. This affects all of those things that, yes, the fire may come, but if you can't afford to stay in your home, that's not a maybe situation. That's a real life thing that will happen. If you can't afford your mortgage, just like 32% of Americans across the country in August couldn't afford to do their mortgage payments on time or in full, the fire may come, but you know for sure that your mortgage is coming every month. And if you can't afford to stay in your home, this is a serious problem.
Okay, I have a question for Josh. I know that Larimer County, we passed a bond issue for the mental health facility. So that brings in a certain amount of money. If this were to pass or to fail, would the bond be in jeopardy for not being paid because they're not bringing in enough money? Or was it de-Gallagherized? That's a new term for me. I haven't heard that before.
So fortunately, Larimer County doesn't have any general obligation debt or revenue bond debt. The mental health facility and those programs were funded with a sales tax. And so,
okay.
Yeah, so that rate is set, and the revenue will come in or not, depending on how the economy does.
Okay, so that's based on sales.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, Bernie, I think you wanted to answer Clay in some way about the residents. Now, the only thing I would ask both of you, I guess, is when we talk in big numbers of billions, that doesn't mean a lot to me. Yeah. But it's just too much. But when you're talking,
a couple billion here, a couple billion there.
Yeah, right.
Then you're talking real money.
Yes, but when you're talking about a homeowner who is facing a tax increase, what are we talking about? Are we talking $1,000? Are we talking $50? Are we talking $500? Do we know?
We ran those numbers for the city and county of Denver, because it's going to change how much for every homeowner, because the number of special districts any particular home is in changes. You know, you could have your house on one side of the street and the exact same house on the other side, and how much you pay in taxes could vary wildly depending on which special districts you're in and where the lines are for that. So Denver was easy for us to do, just to give us sort of instructive on that. And what we found is that it's about, that assuming 10% increase in actual value after the next assessment next year, which in Denver is low, but we assumed the 10% that the tax administrator talked about, that came out to about $568 a year, which for some people isn't. I'm sorry.
An increase of $568.
An increase of $568 over
how
what
much
you would otherwise pay on this.
Okay.
Are you talking $1 million house? Are you talking a?
That was using the average house cost in Denver, which I think is currently at $386,000. And so we used what the average house cost in Denver was, and we ran the numbers what it would be with the 5.88 assessment rate, and at what amendment would do, which is the 7.15. And so that's what that number difference is.
I can tell you the numbers that we've looked at are significantly different. Using $300,000 of value and a 7.15 assessment rate means that $22,500 of that house is taxed, and the average mill levy around the state is 60 mills. That works out to right about $1,200 total taxes on that house. It's higher in the Denver metro area. It's lower in some of our rural areas because of different mill levies. The difference would be about 10 or 15% if the house maintains its value. Now, if the house goes up in value, which it may have done in the metro area, but it has not done in rural Colorado, then the assessment rate is the determining factor in how much taxes change.
And that's interesting because the things I've seen, I think I actually pulled this off of the Special District Association of Colorado's website. And I'm not 100% sure of that, but I'm pretty certain. They said that the average mills across the state, when you included special districts and you included local colleges and you included municipalities and you included counties and you included school districts, which is all of that, that the mill number was 91.16 mills. So that's another 30 plus mills off of what you were saying, Bernie. So
and Clay, I'm not going to dispute that. The mill levies vary pretty widely around the state,
all over the place, right?
The mill levies for school range from 2 to 28, and that's a whole nother problem. But
you hit on that's exactly right, Bernie. Is that you've hit on the fact that some rural districts tend to vote less liberally as far as going for tax hikes, and
that brings me into something. Now, how does that affect the state budget? Because we read and we hear that the state then has to backfill these various, I don't think they backfill hospital districts. I don't know that.
They backfill school districts.
So then they take that out of the general fund of the state budget, right? And so so here we have a state university that keeps getting less and less and less money from the state. And so how do we solve this mishmash of a problem?
Barbara, you hit on one of the key factors. The change in assessment rate next year will, if it's allowed to go into effect, would drive approximately a $500 million decrease to school districts around the state. The way that the 1992 School Act works is that the state is required to backfill that $500 million. But
though you don't
Clay
always actually do that.
Clay talks about the the effects of the coronavirus, but one of those effects is that the state's budget doesn't have that $500 million. They're already not fully funding K-12. This would certainly result in less dollars to K-12 and almost certainly a considerable amount less to higher education. That's why, for example, today I talked to Western State University. A couple of days ago, we talked to Adams State. All of these colleges and universities that are looking at this are saying, you've got to pass Amendment B, because the alternative is we're going to get less from the state and kids are going to pay higher tuition.
Okay.
But that brings up one of the big problems that I have about Amendment B, Bernie, which is that if Amendment B passes, Gallagher, dealing with Gallagher alone, doesn't get the state out of its hole that it has right now. Gallagher doesn't solve your issue on this.
It does. It solves this issue, Clay.
It doesn't solve the amount of unfunded to districts that we're doing based on Amendment 23. And it doesn't solve the fact that we have an economic downturn. So what I don't understand, I've known you for almost 20 years, and you and I are usually on the same side of things. And so the fact that we're beating on each other tonight aside, I know where you come from, and I know that you also understand that Colorado's tax problem isn't just Gallagher. It's Gallagher, it's Tabor, it's Amendment 23. What I don't understand is that if you're going to go to a statewide referendum to change the tax code, why didn't you change the tax code to get over the problem that these three things together do? Why did you, of all the things you could have gone after, of these three, why did you go after the one that affects homeowners? Why are you doing on the backs of homeowners?
You know the answer to that. And it's we've got this other constitutional provision that you didn't mention of a single subject. We can only do one subject in one amendment.
Yes.
But you didn't do that on this one. This one is more than two subjects.
No,
and that's the lawsuit that's coming anyway.
No, it is one subject because it simply strikes language that exists in the Constitution. And
okay.
That's clearly established as one subject.
Right. Josh, tell us, if this passes, how will it affect Larimer County? What are the commissioners thinking about here?
So if you'd like to show that chart that I shared with you, this could be a good time.
Okay. I think we can do that. Can we show the chart now?
Yeah. Our commissioners, we have one who will be here next year. We have two who are term limited, and so they're going to be replaced with a new Board of County Commissioners. They are very cognizant of the challenges that we may face should this amendment fail. And we generally plan our forecasts and our finances as if it will. And so that's the genesis of the chart. I don't know if you're sharing it or not. So this is a forecast we did over the summer showing the impact possibly of Gallagher Amendment on our general fund property tax revenue. The general fund receives, I want to say 95% of the property tax revenue that goes to the county. It funds those sort of core functions that the county is charged with, such as law enforcement, the Office of the Sheriff, the Office of the District Attorney, the Office of the Coroner, and then our assessor, our clerk and recorder, and then some general functions such as human resources, finance, the budget, and the county commissioners. What we see is in 2021, we're actually projecting an increase of property tax revenues, mainly because our Board of County Commissioners provided a one-time credit in 2020 of about $3.5 million. And so that will go away next year. And then there'll be a slight amount of growth in property values as new construction is assessed. In general, in the odd numbered years, we see anywhere from a 1 to a 1.5% increase. There's also, because this is one fund of the county, there's a couple of $1 million that we're shifting from our road and bridge fund back over to the general fund. And then what we see in 2022 is an assumption if the residential assessment rate does drop from 7.15 down to 5.88%. A couple of other assumptions in there for what happens in 2022. This was also done, back in May and June when COVID was, still fairly scary. We didn't know exactly what was going to happen with the economy. So we had projected that our commercial values would drop by about 10%. I think the state's Joanne Groff's estimate assumed that it would drop by 20% statewide. We didn't want to assume that they would drop that badly, I guess. There's also the assumption that residential values, I think, dropped just a little bit. Larimer County also has some oil and gas, not nearly as much as our neighbors to the east, but we do have some that generates, say, between $5 and $6 million of property tax revenue. At the time this was done, oil prices had just crashed, and so we were thinking that we should assume that that would drop very significantly. Complicated math together, and we basically assumed that the general fund would lose in 2022 about $14.1 million of property tax revenue. Funds that receive our general county mill, our bridge, our human services department, and then our public health department lose probably about another $2 million from this impact. And so you can see then what we sort of projected as maybe a worst case in the near term, but a best case in the long term, is that there would be a recession and values would stay relatively flat in 23. And then in 2024, for the budget, those values would start to rise again. The county in general has done pretty well, especially coming out of recessions. Even with the decline in the residential assessment rate, the assessed values have actually increased anywhere from 10 to 20%, even with the drop in the residential assessment rate. So we're one of those counties that can be, when that drops, as long as values continue to go up and growth continues, the county will be okay revenue-wise. And so you see that revenues start to increase out in 26 and 28. And then what's not really apparent on this graph is a couple of large tax increment financing districts that would expire out in 2030. And so that's one reason you see a big jump in revenues out far. So that in the short term really is largely the impact to the county. The general fund is those sort of basic that, it's not the ranch, it's not natural resources, the open spaces, those are funded with sales tax. So they're not impacted by this. But it could be services such as alternative sentencing of the sheriff, the clerk and recorder, and things like that.
Okay, very good. So now we have a bit of a local perspective on that. I think that maybe we've talked this out. Do you have any particular points you would like to bring forward that we've missed? I think we've talked about the divide of the rural and urban. I think that we have some idea about the impact of this if it passes or fails. And I'm not sure whether in Larimer County, how that would make a huge difference one way or another. I can see that for their tax rate, it's going down significantly if this were to pass, but I don't know if we're sure that it has to do with the 5.88 or if it has to do with the pandemic recession. I don't know if that's a fair assessment or not. You're free to correct me.
Barbara,
go ahead.
Barbara, some of this is driven by the pandemic. The way that the assessments work is seeing some really odd things that maybe is making this adjustment worse than it would otherwise be, but it is what it is. And the impacts of Gallagher are real. And I would just like to close by saying, I've worked on a lot of projects as Clay has. but I've never worked on one before where the National Federation of Independent Businesses has endorsed it and the AFL-CIO. You don't normally see that. We've got the CEA, which is the largest teachers union, and we've got the Colorado Association of School Boards. Nearly every chamber that has looked at this has endorsed it, ranging from the Denver Chamber to the Aurora Chamber to the Grand Junction Chamber, and all three of the regional organizations, Club 20, Action 15, and Progressive 22. The Colorado Concern Business Group has endorsed this, and Colorado Children's Campaign feels very strongly that this is one of the most important things that we can do to protect the financial integrity of the state. We've got 3,200 special districts out there that depend on property taxes for their day-to-day work, and we cannot let them see the type of cuts that would come next year if we don't get referendum P passed. So I'd ask everyone that's watching this to support the passage of referendum B, and I would thank the League of Women Voters and Fort Collins for giving us this platform to try to explain a terribly difficult, complex subject. And I'd end by saying, at the end of the day, why in the world do we put things like this in our Constitution?
Yes. We
don't need to put formulas in our Constitution. This is the worst. Let's get it out of there.
Okay, that was one thing we didn't cover, is why is it in the Constitution? But anyway, It is.
and
Clay, go ahead.
And I'll start by answering that one question. Why is it in the Constitution? Because 76% of the voters in the state in 1982 thought that protecting the values and how much they would have to pay in property taxes on their homes necessitated doing that. The three things you need to understand about Amendment B are, number one, it's an effective tax increase for homeowners. Number two, it's an effective tax increase on renters. And number three, it's an effective tax break for big businesses, corporations, and oil and gas interests. And that's the one I really want to talk about in closing here. I've talked to you about the $450.5 million, which you'll pay extra. Homeowners across the state will pay extra if this passes. But the thing that we haven't talked about is that this Amendment B locks in what the top rate that you can pay if you're a business at the 29%. What it doesn't take into account is that given the decreased valuations that initially came out, this could be $1 billion tax cut for businesses next year. And that may come back up as the pandemic eases and the economic crisis eases. But the one thing we know for sure is that big business and corporations have tremendous sway at the legislature. 256 pages of lobbyists. I got off the Secretary of State's website today when I printed it up. Those are all people who are out there not working for homeowners. They're working for big business interests. Bernie started this off by saying that this is going to affect, that it's the small mom and pop businesses that get killed on these higher rates. My family has been in commercial real estate my entire life. We do small strip centers. And so I see the effects of these taxes have on my tenants and have on my family directly. And the one thing I know for sure is that if there's a tax break to be done, it's not going to happen for mom and pop businesses. It's going to be for the big corporations that don't pay their tax burden on their sales tax anyway. Those are the people who are going to see the big decreases in their tax burden.
Okay,
and I think it's reprehensible that we
off there because we have a time limit.
Okay.
Josh, would you like to add anything?
No, just thank you for having me, and hopefully I helped contribute to the understanding of the issue. And
yes, we appreciate the local perspective. That was very good. I didn't know that we could go for an hour on this, but we did. And I thank you all very much. We thank you all, the panelists and the audience, We hope you will encourage others to watch this and other CrossCurrents programs. We also have a program on Proposition 114, the reintroduction and management of gray wolves, that is also on the ballot. We did that one way back in February. They are both available at the League of Women Voters website and at FCTV channels 14 and 881. They are also available on YouTube. Search for fcgov.com/FCTV. Thanks again for tuning in, and please make sure you vote.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.